I'm sure there will be some more folks joining us in the next couple minutes. I'd like to begin. I'm Mark Stevenson, the new president of Napa Solano Audubon. My sidekick, Tom Sliker, should be joining us soon. He's the vice president. We had a wonderful day today. We went birding at Bodega and were able to come up with some really fun birds. Hi, Ellen and Kathy. We were able to see a redstart, find a redstart at the Campbell Cove. And then we found two clay-colored sparrows at Owl Canyon. And then we went down to the Valley Ford wetlands and were able to find a palm warbler. So we had a very exciting day. We birded other spots in throughout the Bodega area and saw a lot of our Western birds there as well. Can everyone hear me okay? Can I see thumbs up for those of you that are live? Okay. First of all, a couple of announcements. One, we were able to get our second birding notes out last Friday. Tom has done a super job with the birding notes, and we have managed to be able to post them on our website. For those of you that either don't have active email or have lost the email, they are now posted. In the left-hand column of our website by events is a category called birding notes. And you can click on that and bring up a PDF of the birding notes that have come out so far. Eventually, we're going to have a photo there on the top of that page, and we're still learning how to place photos on the website pages. A second announcement is a really important announcement, and that has to do with our Benicia Christmas bird count that has been led by Robin Lyon for over 30 years. Robin is in the beginning portion of retiring to the island of Hawaii. And so we are searching for people who love birding, who love the Christmas bird counts, and can co-lead the Benicia bird count, which he leads, and learn from Robin this year and help him take over for next year. So if you have any interest at all in Christmas bird counts, you need some skill with Excel spreadsheets and databases, which logs in all the information from the different birding groups. This year, our Christmas bird counts will be very different since we probably will not be having a dinner at the conclusion of the Christmas bird count due to the COVID crisis. But so it'll make it easier this year to be a co-host with Robin Lyon. So if you have any interest at all in that, some of the jobs that are required for being coordinating a Christmas bird count are having time prior to the meeting to send out letters to participants of people whose land we go on to try to find all the birds in that 15-mile circle. Secondly, to be able to log in the birds using Excel. And third, just being an outgoing person to get a team for that Christmas bird count of 50, 60, or 70 people to help organize the different teams that go out into different areas within a 15-mile circle. Robin has done a great job for more than 30 years and deserves some time off. So hopefully there is someone out there that will be willing to step forward and help Robin this year and then continue on in the future. We just sent out a survey to folks yesterday, and within one day, we've had over 80 responses from Audubon members and friends, and I really appreciate that. If you received that SurveyMonkey survey from us, please take, it really only takes a couple of minutes to fill out. There are only 8 questions. We'd appreciate if you do that. That gives us valuable information on what your interests are and your needs, and we will do our best to try to serve you in the coming months. The other announcement I have, I was hoping that Nancy, our board member, could be here this evening, but she is co-leading another Zoom meeting at this current moment. But on the conservation front, AB 1788 passed, which bans the use of rodenticides in the state of California. And this is great because people that were using rodenticides were poisoning birds inadvertently, the birds that feed on those rodents. Also, even more amazing, Governor Newsom has signed an executive order in support of the measure called AB 3030, which essentially is trying to protect, it may be people are having trouble logging in. And if you are having logged in, it could be, did you need to use the passcode to sign in, or did you just sign right in? Raise your hand if you needed a passcode. Okay, so some people may need the passcode. It is on our website and is on the information that we sent out. If that's a difficulty getting logged in, please check that passcode and submit it. Zoom is now requiring that passcode, I think, for most people to join a meeting. So going back to the support of AB 3030, an executive order signed by the governor, it is setting aside 30% of state lands to help with the conservation efforts and also for to protect the air and the water. So he's also setting aside 30% of the coastal waters to help with the depletion of carbon in the air. So this is a great executive order by the governor, and it's in support of AB 3030, which I hopefully eventually the entire law will pass. Tom Sliker has joined us. Tom, are you there? Tom will be monitoring our chat. So we will have a chat session going on. If he will monitor the chat, and if people have questions during the speaker, you can just chat them in. And at the end or during the discussion, Dr. Lyon will be happy to answer some of those questions. The other plea is if you are an active birder, don't hesitate to contact Tom Sliker to give him information on local birding. He will include that in our birding notes that goes out every couple of weeks. And particularly, he's interested in bird sightings that you've had, places that you've gone to look for birds, and exciting places that you can share with others in our group to help them become more active during this particular time. So I guess without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Bruce Lyon. He is a professor at UC Santa Cruz in the I forget which department you're in, Bruce. I'm sorry. You can.
I'll tell you guys, yeah.
More about that. But he has some very exciting information and data that he's been collecting over more than 15 years on sparrows that return to the Arboretum at UC Santa Cruz year after year after year. And they've been studying their behavior. And this should be a really exciting talk. So please, let's turn the show over to Dr. Bruce Lyon, who will be speaking with you and sharing his screen with some really fun shots of golden-crowned sparrows.
Thanks very much. I'll sort of chat as I'm setting up the screen share. Yeah, I'm at UCSC in the Ecology and Evolutionary Biology department. I study behavior and social behavior, ecology, evolution, and let's see what I have to do for screen sharing. There we go. Let's just see if that works. So let me just check in. Is that now, everybody's seeing my screen?
Perfect.
Perfect. Whoa, it did not, oh, somehow it did not go to that. Sorry, I'm gonna have to go back. It somehow jumped way ahead. It didn't go to my title slide for some reason. There, are you seeing my title slide?
Yes.
Sparrows in the Mist, perfect.
Yes, there you go.
Okay, thanks everybody for coming, but actually the most exciting thing I just heard was the rodenticide news. I've been really annoyed. I'm from Canada, and coming to California and just watching the decimation. All the bobcats in our area have been poisoned pretty much. So that's really exciting news for me that the rodenticide ban may have gone in, has become law. So I'm stoked about that. So thanks for making my day. I'm a behavioral ecologist. I've worked at Santa Cruz now for just over 20 years. I normally study breeding birds, but this sparrow project was my first foray into studying non-breeding birds, and it came about by accident. They're on campus. We were looking at the sparrows as part of an undergraduate class, and then some former graduate students of mine convinced me that we should just keep studying them and turn them into a study. And so what started really, really small just kept growing and growing over the years. And we're now, I think, beginning our 18th season of a study of these birds, migratory birds that winter in Santa Cruz. So pay attention to the title, Sparrows in the Mist. It really is often sparrows in the mist because we're on the coast, but this year it could be sparrows in the fog. This is what it looks like, or sparrows in the smoke. We've all been in the middle of these fires. So the Arboretum looks like this on some days, but not because of fog, but because of smoke. My title comes from this. Most of us are older. We remember this movie. It was called Gorillas in the Mist. And it was about Dian Fossey, who went off to Africa to study gorillas. At the time, one of the more poorly understood great apes. The chimpanzees had been done, and so Dian Fossey went off. And if you look at, this is from the movie starring Sigourney Weaver. And if you look over here, I'm going to get my laser color, my laser pointer on. If you look over here, she left everything she knew and entered a world few have ever seen. And basically, this is about the trials and tribulations of figuring out the social behavior of a mammal that lived in probably interesting societies for which we knew nothing. And so my title comes from a similar sort of endeavor, and that's Sparrows in the Mist. And that's the adventures of a little brown bird. And as you can see up top, unlike Dian Fossey, I did have to leave the comfort of my home and my coffee, but instead of traveling across the world, my house is a 3-minute voyage from my study area. So this is right in my backyard. So it's very, very convenient. And so instead of Dian Fossey saying she went too far, some of my colleagues say I didn't go far enough. But as fun as it was to make this poster in Photoshop, there actually is a connection. There's a logical and biological connection to the Gorillas in the Mist story and the Sparrows in the Mist story. And we'll see there's a bit of a surprise. It turns out that the birds are not that different from gorillas in some interesting ways. Not that they're smart, but their social behavior. And then we'll return to that. So I just want to give a thanks to the Arboretum. They've provided logistic support. And little did they know many, many years ago, several decades ago, when they planted all these Australian plants, that it would be an ideal area for golden-crowned sparrows. So there's a high density of sparrows in the Arboretum, and it turns out to be a pretty ideal study site to work on these birds. And it's actually it's very timely to give this talk because the sparrows are just coming back. So for those of you that know birding by ear, you'll realize that in the last week, you've started to hear the golden-crowned sparrows singing as they're coming back to the Bay Area. And we've just had them coming back to the Arboretum. And in the last week or two, they've been returning to various sites in the Bay Area. And so these are my two partners in crime, two former grad students that are now both professors themselves, one in Nebraska, one in France. And we've been working on this for 18 years. So in addition to having the fun of working on sparrows, I get to continue the project working with two people that I really love dearly, my former grad students, and that are a lot of fun to work with. So science is often very collaborative and very social, and our sparrow, just like our sparrows are social, the research project itself is social and involves lots of people. And we've had, in addition, lots and lots of volunteers, over 70 volunteer undergraduates have helped us for 1 or 2 quarters a year. And because it's right on campus, it's a great opportunity for undergraduates to be involved in research. And they haven't just been doing this for their own learning, which is an important thing. They've actually been helping us get important data. And we've had one graduate student now, Theodora Block, she's just finishing her thesis, and 2 people from the community that are not really affiliated with the university, Inga Marie and Jenny Anderson, who have been working with us for almost the full length of the study and who are principal investigators in some ways in their own right. So this has been a very collaborative project. And the people, as I said, the people make it as fun as the birds. So in terms of the motivation for this study, migratory birds have split personalities. So this shows from the Birds of North America Online, the Cornell handbook account, the breeding range and the wintering range of golden-crowned sparrows. So they breed in the north in Alaska, Yukon, and British Columbia. And then they come down and winter in southern British Columbia and down here. This is our area here. And in addition to these 2 parts of their lives, they undergo a personality change. In the breeding grounds, like many songbirds, it's a mom and pop sort of organization. They're not social, they defend strict territories, and they raise a family in terms of a nuclear family. They then, that territory breaks down at the end of the breeding season. They form flocks to migrate. They migrate down to our area, and they winter in social groups. So they go from being obsessed with sex and defending a territory in summer to being very social and being obsessed with food and avoiding being predation in winter. And as a biologist, if you look at the literature, for most birds, we know an awful lot about what they do in breeding. Biologists are obsessed with sex, mating, and breeding. And so we've studied extensively for migratory birds what they do in breeding. But in contrast, the details of what they do in winter are very poorly studied. So our motivation for doing the study was to just try and redress this imbalance and find out a little bit more about what these birds do in winter. And more than just in passing. So the basic natural history that these birds winter in groups was known, but the specifics of what those groups are and how they interact and their social behavior is very poorly known for most bird species. And so my perspective in all of this, I'm what's called a behavioral ecologist, and behavioral ecologists take an evolutionary perspective to behavior. And what that means is we want to know why individual birds do what they do and how they benefit from those particular behaviors and features. So it's thinking about behavior as adaptation, and it's focusing on the variation that we see among individuals. So as you'll see, everything that we do means that you have to measure, band, and follow individuals. And to do that, jewelry. Here's a golden-crowned sparrow. It's in breeding plumage because it's just about to fly to Alaska. And it has a purple band and an orange band on its left leg, and a purple band and a metal band, aluminum metal band from the Fish and Wildlife Service on its right leg. And this is the only bird in our population in the last 20 years that has this unique combination of color bands, which means it's like a social security number. If we see in the field with our binoculars this combination of color birds, we know which individual this is. We know how old it is. When we banded it, we have measurements for it. So it's these color bands that are essential for allow us to follow individuals across time and look at their behavior and measurements when we catch them for banding. So what I'm going to do now is really talk a little bit about the natural history. Before we get to the science, I'll talk about the natural history that motivated the science and a little bit about how we study the birds. And then I'll give you a list of the 3 questions that are the most important questions in our study. And then I'll focus on answering those questions. But to start with, we'll just talk about some basic natural history and some basic methods. The birds live in flocks. And so here you can see a small flock of 3. The flocks can be anywhere from 2 birds. Sometimes the birds are antisocial and are by themselves, but you can get flocks of 2 to 10 individuals, and even extraordinarily, sometimes up to 15 or 20 birds in a flock. So they forage out in the open areas and spend their time in flocks. And it's well known for birds in general that living in groups has costs and benefits. And a major benefit of living in groups is that it brings you safety from predation. So here's a sharp-shinned hawk on my backyard that took out a robin, and many, many studies have been done on various species of birds, and it's well known that living in a group reduces the chance that this will happen. And that's for a couple of reasons. Is you can cause confusion by being in a flock, so the predator can't pick one of you out. When you're in a flock, there's lots of eyes watching out for predators, and a lot of these birds have well-developed alarm call systems. So if anybody sees a predator, everybody gets to hear about it. And then even if you can't reduce the risk of this sharp-shinned hawk attacking you, if you're in a group of 20 as opposed to by yourself, the risks of you being the one that's eaten are diluted greatly when you're in a flock. So that's called dilution of predation risk. So this is a fundamental benefit of living in flocks. And many birds that are not social in summer because they need a territory to breed become social in winter because the benefits from avoiding predation risk are so high. Living in groups also comes with costs. And the main cost is you're competing for food. If you're living in flocks and all eating in the same area, then the food that's in the environment is not necessarily for everybody, or the high quality food or the best patches might not be available. And so the birds fight and compete over food. And golden-crowned sparrows, like other birds that live in groups, compete for food. Here's a golden-crowned sparrow that's hogging a seed pile. They love the millet seed that we provide them. So if some of you have bird feeders, you may get golden-crowned sparrows at those feeders. But when they're not eating bird seed that we provide them, these are largely vegetarian birds. It's really interesting. Unlike most small birds, these birds eat a lot of grass and vegetation and leaves and sort of young, high quality leaves, which is an unusual diet for a small songbird. And they also love flowers and nectar. And so I think we've wondered a little bit whether the peculiar social behavior we see in these birds might reflect their interesting vegetarian diet, but that's just pure speculation. Everything we do in terms of our behavioral observations is done in a spatial context. And rather than use GPS, because we're often observing flocks from a distance with our binoculars, we've developed a grid map system. And with Google Earth, you can now get photos that are accurate down to a bush. So this is a map of our main study area. Each of these little squares is a 10 meter by 10 meter, which is the same as 10 yard by 10 yard square. And it's very localized. So whenever we see birds by themselves or in a flock, we're able to note the location by the letter and the number of the grid on the map. So it's a very easy way to put our observations into a spatial context. And when we go a little bit later, we'll see that there's actually some interesting spatial aspects to where these birds hang out. And these yellow dots are feeding stations. So for the past 18 years, we have sites where we put out seed and the birds come to those sites. We trap the birds at those seeds. And then we also do behavioral observations of the birds interacting and competing for the seeds. So we're able to both use these as trapping sites and to get behavioral observations of which birds are socially dominant over other birds. We catch the birds with a trap that's called a Potter trap. We don't use mist nets because they're not as effective. A Potter trap has a little trip door. You can see this barred trip door to get to the seed in behind, and then the door falls down. And it's incredibly effective. We can sometimes catch 20 or 30 birds in a single day when we're banding birds. And it turns out that it's mostly sparrows that like our traps. So unlike when you're mist netting and you're catching everything in the area and spending most of your time removing birds from mist nets, this is a very, very efficient way to catch our sparrows. We've caught a lot of sparrows. So we've been doing this since 2004. And on the main study area, we've banded over 1,600 individual birds, each with a unique color combination of bands. And just as an aside, these are kids' toys. It turns out you can spend 25 cents for a professional bird band, or you can go to Toys R Us and for $5 buy 5,000 of these things, and they make just great bird bands. So you can save money by getting kids' toys to use as bands. It turns out that the sparrows are very site faithful across years. So this bird, red, green, yellow, metal, we might have banded, let's make a number up, we banded it in 2004. And at the end of the winter, in April, it'll migrate to wherever it goes. Alaska, we still don't know exactly where they go. And then the next fall, it returns. And so they go off to breed, but every year, if they're alive, they come back to the Arboretum. So we see the same individuals winter after winter after winter. And some of these birds, in extreme cases, can live 8 or 9 years. Typically, it's 1 or 2 or 3, but some of these birds can live a long time, and they continually come back to the Arboretum and to the same exact patch. And something like 40 to 50% of the birds from last year return across seasons after breeding, they return back to the Arboretum. So we're following individuals for every winter of their life, which is very few studies have done that for migratory birds. Some of the things we found from trapping so many birds, the thing that stands out most is in winter, their plumage crown, the plumage patches on their crown vary phenomenally. You can have birds in winter that basically look like they're still in breeding plumage with the dark stripe and the yellow in the middle. And you can have other birds like this one down here that have maybe a tinge of yellow, and some birds can lack color altogether. And what's interesting about this is that the variation in winter greatly exceeds the variation in summer. Dai Shizuka, one of my the collaborators I mentioned early on, has been studying these birds, different populations of these birds in Alaska. And in summer, they all look pretty much like this. There's much less variation. So when they molt in the fall, before they migrate and come to Santa Cruz, they're molting out of conspicuous feathers, in some cases, to this dramatic variation. So some individuals remain bright, other ones remain turn dull, so it's pretty interesting. So something interesting is going on given this explosive variation we see in winter compared to summer. The other thing, as you can hear, oh, I'm not sure, can someone indicate whether you can hear this? I think I did not tick. Can you hear this, Mark?
Yes, I can hear it.
Oh, good. I forgot to share my sound, but I think that's the default now. So that's, let me see if I can play that again. That's a golden-crowned sparrow. It doesn't want to go back. Oh, did it freeze on me because I tried to do something smart? All right, let's go.
Yeah, I could hear it.
Good. That's something you'll be hearing a lot. And they sing in winter. And we know the birds are supposed to sing in summer, but to have a bird that comes in winter and sings so much is pretty interesting. And in fact, these guys sing so much that it becomes the sound of fall. When you hear the golden-crowned sparrows show up and sing, you go, oh, it's fall. Should get out there and start paying attention to the migratory birds. So it's a notable winter singer. So far, the two things that caught our attention that will be the focus of the study are this plumage variation, this winter song. And then once we started banding the birds, we sicked an undergrad on looking at the flocking behavior, a guy by the name of Oscar Johnson. I don't know, some of you may know him. He's a phenomenal birder. And Oscar showed us that we could actually figure out flocking behavior. And we weren't sure that we could actually watch the birds flock. It turns out it's easy. And once we started watching these birds in flocks and seeing which individuals were involved, we realized that the flocks were interesting. There was some dynamics going on here. It's not like these 4 birds would always be together. There were changes. And so that raised, and when I get to the third question is, what is the actual pattern of social organization? What's a flock? How stable is a flock? And is there any structure above and beyond these short-term flocks, or is the sparrow world completely random? And so that was the third question, was really about what's the pattern of social organization? And that connects back to the primate sort of question, the gorillas in the mist. It was the same sort of questions that motivated Diane Fossey or Jane Goodall to go to Africa and say, like, what's the social structure of primates? So the focus of the study, just to reiterate, was first trying to understand the plumage variation and asking if it's actually a signal. And I'll explain what I mean by that in just a minute. And so does this plumage variation mean something? And then briefly, I'll look at progress to date in why do these birds sing in winter? This is a project we've got the data, we're just starting to really analyze the data now. And then third, something we've figured out pretty clearly and was kind of a bit shocking to us, which is addressing what is the pattern of social organization in these guys? What is the actual society? What is the winter society? Putting on our primate hats, what's the structure here beyond just the fact that they hang out in flocks for a period of time? So the first question is, does crown variation function as a signal? And we were not the first to raise this question by a long shot, but it's interesting in our birds because notice they have two plumage colors, yellow and black. There was a fairly large and developing literature on this for birds and other animals in general. And the very first study to look at this was on a close relative of the golden-crowned sparrows. Harris sparrows is in the same genus, Zonotrichia, as golden-crowned sparrows. And this is the winter plumage of Harris sparrows. And a biologist by the name of Sievert Rohwer, here, he worked for the Burke Museum at Washington. And museums collect birds to study and to create a historical archive of various things. And Sievert collected a series of Harris sparrows in Kansas. And what he noticed instantly was, as we noticed with our sparrow crowns, phenomenal variation in the amount of black on the front and head of Harris sparrows. Some of them had very little black, and some of them had a lot of black. And Sievert is a very good naturalist. I just got him thinking, like, why would they do this? He realized that they lived in flocks. He realized in summer, just like golden-crowned sparrows, Harris sparrows are all similar. So he started to think, like, why would birds in flocks all of a sudden, or not all of a sudden, why would birds that live in flocks in winter have this variable plumage? And he realized that they have to fight for food. And he realized that if you have to fight for every scrap of food, it gets risky. And he came up with the idea that maybe this plumage is a signal of fighting ability, so they can just look at each other, and rather than fight for every scrap of food, they could use this signal as a way of saying, okay, you've got this guy here, number 14, you've clearly got a big bib on you, you're a dominant burly bird, I'm going to defer to you. So the idea was that this might be a competitive signal. It's called a badge of status. And Rohwer did some experiments and some tests and showed for Harris sparrows that that's absolutely true, that this bird would probably win a fight over this bird. And so and now this has been shown in reptiles, fish, insects, mammals, that these kind of competitive signals are widespread in nature. So we wanted to ask if that was the case in golden-crowned sparrows. And here's a bird showing off its crown. You can't see off picture. Here is another bird, and this bird is actually showing its head. The fact that they display their crowns when they're at seed piles and potentially competing over food suggested to us that maybe they are using this as some sort of a signal. So the way we address this issue was for the birds that we capture during banding, we take a photograph of the bird's head. It's very easy in Photoshop to extract just the pixels, the photographic pixels that are either black or that are gold. And then there's some Photoshop tools that allow you to count those pixels. And if you have a reference ruler in there, you can then convert the pixels to actual areas. So we can tell you very accurately what the exact surface area in terms of square inches or square centimeters of black plumage or gold plumage. So we're able to, with some simple photography, say, how big is the black patch on this individual? How big is the yellow patch? So along with all the banding data, we then have a measure of the patch. And then we go in nature and we watch birds at feeders, realizing that we already have on file information about their patches, and we figure out who's dominant, who's subordinate, and then we can ask if the plumage patches predict dominance. And interestingly, there's two ways to determine who's socially dominant. There's actual aggression. So here's a bird that's just chased this bird away. This bird was happily eating the seed, and this guy with the purple metal band came in and chased it away. So that's what we call that a usurp, a chase, as if they run after each other. And sometimes, but not very often, they fight. But it turns out that much of the time, they don't even have to do this. They can just figure it out, and even dominant bird with a bold plumage crown hogging the seed pile. And here we have this bird with a really wimpy patch, drooling in hunger, looking at the seed pile, but it's just watching. It's not challenging this bird. And so we call that avoidance. This bird is not being challenged by this bird that wants to feed. If the tables were turned and this bird were watching and this dull bird were eating, the dull bird would not be so polite. It would do what's happened here. So basically, if a bird is not challenging a bird, you can tell it's subordinate, even though there's been no aggression, no fighting. And so we have these two ways of assessing dominance. And they come like crazy to the seed pile, so we can get interactions. And what you're trying to do is you're looking at pairs of individuals, not mated pairs, but this bird, and you score which one is dominant. And you do that over and over and over again for the whole population. And you can then put together a dominance hierarchy, or you can ask which birds are dominant over others. There's various ways. And then those data allow you to ask, does plumage explain some of that variation in social dominance? And it turns out that from our just watching these seed piles, there's a very clear pattern. Birds with either a bigger black crown patch or a bigger gold patch are more likely to be dominant in these interactions. And it also turned out, if we then divided the ways that we looked at dominance and asked, what about just the avoidance? Birds with bigger gold patches were more likely to be avoided. And so from this, we wondered if perhaps the reason that golden-crowned sparrows have two different colors of signals is that they use them for different things. The gold is a first step that says, should I even cause a fuss here, or should I mind my own business? And if the difference in the gold patches is big enough, it ends there. If the birds have similar gold patches, often you see an escalation, and then the one with the bigger black patch is more likely to win. This is a statistical outcome of lots and lots of observations. Of course, there might be exceptions, but in general, this is the take-home message from our plumage studies. Now that's great, and you might think we could go home, but as a scientist, you realize observational studies don't always tell the right story, or a phrase that some of you may have had if you've had science classes, correlation is not causation. I've just shown you that plumage correlates with dominance, but it's possible that something else is driving this, and that plumage is actually, plumage might be correlated with something else that's actually determining this, for example, body size. And actually, if we measure birds, we can show that bigger bodied birds are more likely to have bolder, more colorful crowns. So the question is, are these guys dominant because of their plumage crown, or are they dominant because they're bigger? And the only way to separate that is to conduct an experiment, because with an experiment, you can uncouple the correlation between plumage and other variables. And so that's what we did. And the way you do an experiment is you randomly pick birds, and we picked birds that were similar in plumage. And we also picked birds from 2 different areas, several miles apart, so that they would not know each other. Because you want to make sure that if they had prior knowledge, they might settle dominance, and it might be based on their previous experience or fights with individuals and not due to signal. So we wanted strangers that had never met. They were matched originally by their crowns. We flipped a coin and chose one of those birds to get a paint job, a comb over. So here's a bird with a Sharpie pen getting a temporary brow. And then we put them together in an aviary, and these are really docile birds. They immediately settle down and act totally normally in the aviaries. And we can watch the same sorts of social interactions, the same sort of social interactions as we saw in the wild, but now we've controlled it, and we've made one of the birds experimentally with a bigger badge, but everything else is the same. By picking a bird at random, any other variable that correlates with that will have been unbroken. So if this wins fights, then we know for sure it's the experiment. And we did this for the 2 badges. We did 2 separate experiments, one for the black patch and one for the gold patch. And because we wanted to know whether each of these on its own could win fights. And the stats are really easy. The stats, most of you understand the idea behind a coin toss, heads or tails. It's a 50-50 shot. We have 2 birds. And if it's random, and the birds, the idea behind the experiment is if they're not using our experiment, then it should be random who wins. And so the experiment, the what's called the null expectation, the random, if your idea is wrong, should be that Betty here has a 50% chance of winning. Mary here has a 50% chance of winning. That's if the unibrow here doesn't work. If the experiment works, then you should see deviation from random. And the nice thing about this paired comparison is you all have an expectation for a coin toss. And numbers are going to go, yeah, that's not my experience with a random coin. So the enlarged black patches won in 14 of 15 trials. The enlarged gold patch bird won in 16 of 17 trials. I defy you to go and flip a coin 15 times in a row and get 14 heads in a row, or to get 16 tails in a row out of 17. You're going to find out that the probability of doing that is very, very small. So what this told us is our experiment worked. We created a non-random winning pattern whereby the bird that we manipulated was much more likely to win. And what that tells us is they're actually using the plumage patches. Nothing else can explain these patterns. So it's these plumage patches are helping these birds, particularly strangers, figure out their odds in a social interaction of, am I going to likely to win or not? And so I think I told you this, plumage itself settles the dominance because the experiments show that. Black and gold may signal different information. The gold may help individuals figure out whether they should even pick a fight. And then the black may figure out who wins that fight or chase or aggression, given that they escalate. Now, the smart people who are paying attention, not the smart people who are paying attention might realize something, which is birds don't have mirrors. We did a comb over on these birds, but they didn't know we did a comb over on themselves. And so it raises the question, and the only reason I'm addressing this is because we get asked this a lot, is like, how did the birds know? And what we think is happening, this is just a guess, is exactly what's in a poker game that's called Oklahoma Forehead Poker. It's a game of poker where you don't get to see your own cards. You only get to see the cards on your opponent, that your opponents have on their head. And you make a bid based not on what you have, but what others have. And then individuals get information based on all of the bidding. So what we think the Sparrows are doing, this is the Oklahoma poker if you're a Golden-crowned Sparrows, is the winner doesn't know it's a winner until it starts to get respect. So if you change a bird's plumage, all of a sudden it's being treated with respect that it never had before. And so we think it's a feedback based on the interaction, not that the bird all of a sudden goes, oh, look at me, I have this beautiful golden comb over on the top of my head. And so that's what we think is going on, but we're not 100% sure. But we know for sure that birds don't have mirrors, and they probably don't know that we've made them really, really sexy. Moving on to the second question, why do golden-crowned sparrows sing in winter? There's three general hypotheses for why birds might sing in winter that we're aware of. Those of you realize that white-crowned sparrows are coming back now as well. And there was a ton of work done in the Bay Area on how white-crowned sparrows learn their song. And it turns out that young male white-crowned sparrows listen on the breeding grounds when they're still nestlings or fledglings. They hear songs. They form a memory of that. It's called a template in their brain. And then when they migrate down to our area in the Bay Area in December and October through December, yearling males start to practice. So the singers that we hear in white-crowned sparrows are often young males learning how to sing what's in their brain. So they can have a song, they can know what they want to sing, but until they practice their syrinx, the bird's equivalent of a vocal cord, they can't sing it. So in fall, some young males sing a lot to learn how to sing for the next breeding season. So the first hypothesis is that these singers are both young birds and males. So that makes a very, very simple prediction that if this is practicing, it's going to be young males that are singing. Second, we know from a variety of birds, including a bird found in California, the Townsend solitaire, that some birds defend winter territories for winter food. This has been shown in, as I said, solitaires. European robins show this, and both males and females defend territories. And by this, I mean classic territories where there might be either one bird or a pair of birds defending a territory. So the prediction here is if it's a classic territorial defense, that the birds that are singing should be defending exclusive resource territories. And then third, this is just something we sort of came up with for lack of other, is some other, I can see my internet is unstable. Mark, am I mostly coming through, because like my internet's occasionally unstable, but it seems like I'm mostly coming through?
On occasion, your voice is tinny, but otherwise it's been pretty good.
Good. I think that's the unstable thing. It just, I'm paying attention because I get a notification. So if I get an unstable internet, I stop for a couple of seconds, but that's good. Actually, I'm a whiny guy, so the tinny voice is just me sounding whiny. I'm Canadian, and Canadians are whiny, so that's probably just my Canadian dialect. So back to the talk. Some other social function, and that could involve lots of things, and this will be motivated by what we find out about their flocking behavior. So until we know more about their flocking behavior, we don't really know what that social function is, but the general idea is perhaps the song connects to what we're about to discover about their social organization. So very briefly, this is as I said, we're just working this up now. We're able to reject some hypotheses, and then we're working on others. Only some birds sing. So in a year, it's typically 20 to 30% of the birds sing, at least that we see singing. Song is particularly common early in the season. So if you pay attention to golden-crowned sparrows, you'll know that they're singing like crazy now. And by about the end of November, it's slowed down a lot. So it's something about arriving and early in the fall that seems to be particularly important for the song. Both sexes sing. We use molecular techniques. You can't tell male and female golden-crowned sparrows in the hand. And so we've got genetic techniques. We take a small blood sample. We're able to figure out the sex of each of our birds. Both sexes sing, and both sexes sing in what you'd expect in their proportion of the population. Our population is slightly female biased. I believe it's somewhere between 60 and 65% female, and something like 65 to 70% of the singers tend to be female. So clearly the young males practicing argument, as does the observation that most of the singers are birds that we banded in previous years that we know have to be more than 1 year old. When we catch new birds, we don't really know their age. They could be 1 year or older than 1 year, but when you banded a bird and it comes back again, you know it has to be more than 1 year, and most of our singers are older than 1 year. So this tells us that our singers are not young males practicing to learn their song. There's something else going on. And singers, we now know, live in groups. They don't defend solo territories or even paired territories. The singers are embedded in these strong social groups. So the simple idea that they're defending classic territories doesn't apply. I'm going to show you there's a really interesting form of singing too. Sometimes you get birds singing like they do in summer, where it goes to a top of a bush, the bird bursts into song, and then maybe 100 yards away, another bird sings in response. Early in the spring, we see these really, really weird, we call them tethers. And it's like a singing duel. For those of you that have watched The Voice and note that there's these song contests on The Voice, this reminds me of The Voice. These two birds might spend several hours together just singing at each other nonstop. And the reason that we call it tethers is they're never more than a yard apart, and often a few feet apart, a foot or more. They are attached to each other and just singing and singing and singing. It's totally weird. They're clearly laying something down really important. And so here's an example of two birds engaged in a tether. And I think these two birds did this for 2 hours. Mostly one bird sang, but eventually the second bird sings. You can tell there's a one-syllable singer, that guy, and then eventually another bird will sing. It might have 2 syllables. They're flicking their tails and wings. They're kind of agitated. That's the second bird. And so it's remarkable. I mean, you can just watch them and they just will sing and sing and sing and sing and sing. And occasionally come back the next day and they're still there. So it's not just like having a song, they're establishing something. It's pretty remarkable. And just to briefly tell you the work that's currently in progress, it turns out that singers tend to be more dominant than you'd expect based on their plumage, although it's preliminary and we need to rule out the effects of age. But basically, here's Brenda, here's Judy. If Brenda has this sexy black eyebrow, she's likely to be more dominant. But if Judy's a singer and Brenda's not a singer, Judy might well dominate Brenda. Our data show this, that for a given, if you control for amount of black and gold on the plumage, singers tend to be more dominant. As I said, that could be an age effect, but it's somehow, singing is clearly somehow linked to dominance. One other thing that we found that will make sense eventually, I'm going to next, when I get to the pattern of social organization, I'm going to talk about social network diagrams that explain dominance. And there's birds that live in groups, and there's groups and separate groups. Turns out that internet was unstable for a second. Turns out that most of the singing occurs within social groups. So the singing is somehow involved with friends. It still could be dominance, but the singing involves birds that are actually sharing space and interacting the most. And I think that's maybe why we see these really close things we call tethers, is they're setting up something that's going to last for the rest of the winter. And if they can establish it in the first couple of days, then they can stop fussing and get along and go off and feed and warn each other against predators and just not have to worry about predation. So last, a little bit of information about the pattern of social organization. All of you are bird watchers, that's why we're here. And you'll notice in winter, birds live in flocks, a lot of birds. So you can have on the one end, it's been shown for some shorebirds that flocks are random. There's no structure, that basically birds can move across flocks. As long as they're in a flock, they're happy. It's not a flock as a consistent. And so you get very fluid and dynamic flocks that are random with respect to the broader population. On the other extreme, we see phenomenally stable flocks. And this is I love this photo. It's a friend of mine who was in the Galapagos. And here's two groups of cooperative breeding mockingbirds at the border of their territory. They're having a fight, and that territory never changes. And so these are groups of birds that live and breed together, and the group size is stable, can be stable for years and years and years. And so that's, you can think of that as a flock, but the membership is pretty much fixed. And even some of our temperate zone birds, acorn woodpeckers show the same pattern, and even chickadees in winter show this pattern. So this is, social behavior can range from random and very fluid to extremely stable with stuff in between. And so that's been the challenge, which is, what are our sparrows doing? And the way you get at that is you watch flocks, you determine which individuals are in those flocks by their color bands. And over time, we realized that the flocks, we didn't have something stable like Galapagos mockingbirds. Birds were coming and going from the flock, so the membership was a little bit fluid. And the question was, is it completely random with respect to the population, or is there some kind of structure here? And the approach that we used to get at that is an approach called social networks. And I'll just show an example here. Each of these dots is, is a seal or a sea lion. And what these diagrams do is they connect individuals that hang out with other individuals. So any individuals that are connected have been seen together. So you do these observations and you figure out all of the pairs, the duos of individuals that were ever seen together. And then from that, I'll explain in a bit, there's ways to ask, are those associations random, or are there clusters of individuals that socialize more than others? So in these sea lions, the gray individuals tended to socialize with each other way more than they did with the others. And so there were these 6 different groups, and it turned out that they were distributed differently. Whoops, we're getting a bit of reverb here. Someone might need to turn their mic off. And that it was spatial, that basically these little clusters or communities were using different parts of the beach on this island in the Galapagos. And so this is the approach we used for the golden-crowned sparrows, which is to create what are called social networks. And the way you build a social network is you look at every pair of individual, you go out and when you do flocks, and then we might get perhaps 500 different flock observations. Individuals will be seen in lots of those flocks. And then we look at the connections. So here we have these 2 birds. And if there's a strong bond, the bond is the width of this, called an edge, it's the width. So birds that are seen in lots of flocks together will have a big bar here. That's a strong bond. Birds that have a weaker bond, that bar is skinnier. And then birds that are never ever seen together in the same flock, there's no bond. And then there's very sophisticated statistical methods for figuring out if there's clusters. So basically it's a computational intensive way of saying, tell me if there's structure, underlying structure here, or is it just random? And so the first problem is to ask the question, like, what's a flock? There's no God-given definition of what's a flock. You have to decide what a flock is. And that comes from, the natural history of your system. And we decided that birds in a 10-meter radius are in a flock. And it turns out that that works for us, but it could have been 100 meters. So you sort of have to decide a priori what a flock is. And the results you get may depend on your definition. And so what that means is when they're in the Arboretum, when we come across a group of birds, it's not very difficult because the birds do hang out together. And if there's 2 flocks, they're not going to be close together. So generally, it's pretty trivial to go, yep, this is a flock. So here's 2 different flocks, each with 3 different color banded birds in them. And then you do this over and over and over again. And I'm going to show you with some made up data illustrated by my co-author Di of band of birds. And then I'll show you what a network would look like with these fake data. And then you'll be better placed to understand what a real network looks like. So you can see there's red, orange, red, yellow, green, orange. This bird occurs in all of the flocks. Sometimes birds are in the same flock, sometimes they're not. And the lines are all of those connections. And so you connect every bird in a flock, and then you dump that into a giant database, run it through some computational fancy stuff, and you get a network. And this is the network for these 4 flocks. Basically, you can see that red, yellow, and green, orange, whenever they're in a flock, they're together. And you can see that blue, green, and purple, red. Is there purple, red? I think, yeah, there's purple, red. Purple, red are never seen together. And so this is the social network for these sparrows. And what the algorithm does is it tries to ask for clusters that have stronger edges. So you might find a way to sort of cluster these guys into a grouping, and these guys might be in a grouping. And so it's a way to sort of use this information to ask, is there some underlying structure, non-random? Are some birds hanging out with other birds more than expected by chance? And are friends of friends hanging out together? So it's basically like Facebook. It's Facebook for birds and asking whether friendships are random. And it turned out that it's not random at all. This looks an awful lot like that sea lion thing. So in our first season where we were able to do this in January, February 2010, we found 3 main communities on our main study area containing anywhere from 5 to 20 individuals. And what this means is if you start to look at where the data come from, anytime you see a flock, 90% of the birds in a flock come from the same community. So there might be a few connections across communities, but in general, a flock is a subset of a bigger community. That's the structure. So the flocks come and go, but the flocks are composed of a community grouping that differs. And it turned out that those communities, again, just like the sea lions, are spatially separated. We had 3, my mouse is demonic. We had 3 different communities, and they were using different parts of the Arboretum. So the blue community here, maybe I'll try and get my laser pointer. The blue community here was using this part of the Arboretum. There's some overlap, but there's still fairly discrete. What was interesting here is this connects back to the gorillas in the mist, except it should be chimpanzees in the mist. I almost fell out of my chair when I read this, a review paper about chimpanzee social behavior. And it's by John Matani, a famous primatologist. And he said, we now know that chimpanzees live in a fusion society. That means flocks that come and go. Individuals form socially and geographically circumscribed unit groups or communities within which they associate in temporary subgroups, which is exactly what the sparrows are doing. There are some differences. And so I should also point out, this seemingly clear-cut picture of chimpanzee society did not emerge easily for 2 reasons. It took them many years. It's much harder to watch the social affiliations in the forests of East Africa. And second, they didn't have the social network analyses methods to actually figure it out. They had to figure it out using brute mathematical force. And so, but it's kind of interesting that what we're finding in the sparrows is similar to primates. There's an interesting message. Sparrows are smart? No. The take-home message here is chimpanzees are smart. That doesn't mean we should assume that what they're doing in their social organization is connected to their smarts, because we now know that fish do this. There are some, fish, a bunch of animals that we don't think of as being super smart show very similar fission fusion societies. And so an interesting message here is not that our sparrows are smart like primates, but that social organization doesn't always reflect complex thinking, even though very sophisticated organisms may show that social group living. What was remarkable is when we went back 3 seasons in a row, we found the same 3 communities living in the same parts of the Arboretum. And what was remarkable was, I told you the birds have a pretty high return rate. The birds are coming back to the Arboretum. They're finding friends from last year that are still alive, and they're hanging out with them, and they're hanging out with them really tightly. What this means is these sparrows are forming lifelong friendships in the winter, lifelong winter friendships that are super important. They come back to the Arboretum, to the same few bushes, find their friends and hang out with them, which is, that to me is pretty remarkable. And there's probably benefits. We don't understand yet what those benefits are, but there's probably some real benefits to have building up that trust in having friends you've known for a very, very long period of time. And so I just said this, the sparrows form very long friendships, very long-term friendships. When you see these stable groups like in the Galapagos mockingbirds or in acorn woodpeckers, typically it's relatives. And so we got asked this a lot, and I had a grad student do some genetic work. It turns out in the sparrows that these friends are not relatives. They're friends for purely friend reasons, not for nepotistic reasons. And so that was an interesting finding too, that these friendships do not require close relatives to form. So what's next? I'll just finish up with a couple more slides. What I told you we're working on now is sort of integrating the song and the social organization and the plumage. And what we're finding is singers non-randomly are individuals within the same communities that tend to affiliate very closely. So we had wondered whether singers might be individuals from different communities saying, this is my community, stay away from it. That's not the case. It's birds within a community. And so what they're doing somehow is reinforcing the social behavior, perhaps cooperation, perhaps figuring out that they're going to be dominant over each other. Let me just check one more thing. Oh yes, and and the reason that we think this is important is I could have shown you a few more slides, but we repeated the same plumage experiments. I told you that we did the plumage experiments with strangers because we didn't want the strangers to have prior information, and we needed to be able to do that to show that they're using this plumage per se. But now that we know that these birds live in tight communities where they come back year after year after year, we asked, could we fool them? Would one of our experimental comb-overs fool birds that know each other, or are they using different information? And it turns out that when we did the experimental plumage manipulations for birds in the same communities, it had no effect. It was completely random. And so when the birds know each other, if you mess with their plumage features, they ignore it because they know each other. They know, so their reaction is probably like, ah, look at Bob, look at this stupid hairdo on Bob. And so that's pretty interesting. So that shows us that these social patterns are very different. The way that birds compete and the information they use to compete is very different within a community as opposed to strangers that don't know each other. And the song may play a role in that sort of thing, establishing very early on, which is let's get this over in the first few days of winter and then we never have to fight again. That's a hypothesis. But the fact that the singing is primarily within communities and within close associating birds suggests that that's a possibility. So the answer is no, not important. And just as a last little thing, my current grad student, Theodora Block, has been doing some lovely work. You can bring birds into a cage, have them behave, and you measure sort of stereotypical behaviors, and you find out that birds have personalities, just like people. There's some type A sparrows, there's some shy sparrows, there's some really nervous, fidgety sparrows, and we've not only found that sparrows have personalities, but that those personalities persist across winters. So if we catch this bird across winters, it's going to show the same kind of interesting idiosyncratic behaviors across years, which is pretty interesting. And how this relates to their social structure is something that we're still investigating. And so I think I've asked this already. We're interested in whether singers are playing an important role. And that's, don't know yet, but we suspect so. And I think with that, that's the end of my presentation. And if there's time, I'd be delighted to ask questions. And I think the idea was that someone might look at questions in the chat. Mark can correct me if that's not the case, but I think the idea was that if you have questions, you can put them in the chat so that we don't all have people speaking at the same time.
Yeah. Hey, Bruce, this is Tom. We did have a chat session going. I'm assuming you can access that chat session. And there were a number of questions being asked
sure.
During the chat. So if you can go to them and try to answer them, that might be the best thing to do.
I need to somehow, the problem is now that I've got my stupid, I'm not able, I have to stop screen sharing. And now that I've got my laser pointer on, it's not acting as a,
we can possibly read you some of these questions if that's easier.
You might have to, just give me a second. But yeah, this happened last time, is once I use my thing, it freezes up and it won't even let me go back. And now it's doing a scribbly thing. Let's just see. Oh, mouse, hang on.
Tom, you might want to, do you want to take charge of reading them?
Yeah, actually, I'm trying to figure out how to go backwards in the chat. Maybe that's my problem. I can save the chat, but
on the orange thing, then you can scroll back up to the top.
The orange thing.
Mine has how many messages there are.
There, I got it. Never mind. I had to trick it into doing it. So,
okay.
There, now we can do it. It's just, it's a weird thing that if you use a laser pointer, you lose your mouse, and I couldn't get out of it. So chat. All right, let's see. Are the same birds singing year after year? That's a good question. We know that yearlings are less likely to sing. So if you get rid of the yearlings, we need to look at that. We have the data. We've just compiled a cleaned up list of singers, and it would be lovely to see if that's the case. And because it suggests perhaps some interesting things going on. Related to that, if you actually look at the plumage patterns, birds are consistent across years. So some birds will be dull for their whole lives. Some birds will be bright. And given that there's that kind of distinct differences among birds, we wondered if maybe the song might connect to that. So great question, but I don't know. Do birds have the same badge of status year to year? If you ignore yearlings, yearlings tend to be much duller. Females on average tend to be duller than male, but there's a lot of overlap. And if you ignore yearlings, there is some consistency. There's variation, but the way that you can measure, there are statistical measures for looking at consistency, and there are significant consistencies across years in the badges, but there's also some variation as well. But it's clearly not random. A bird that's bold one year is likely to be boldish the next year as well.
Mm-hmm. Here's a question I really like. Do families from breeding groups in summer stick together? Or in other words, do some of the birds from the winter, if they're in that same community group, do they go to similar, to breeding areas with the same birds?
That's such a great question. And the reason that I'll say first why we wanted to ask that question is,
it's a free trip to British Columbia, right?
Yeah, and we also want to know how when birds die, the groups shrink, but then new birds come in. And we wanted to know whether these friendships involved youngsters coming in together. We did a giant tagging study, and the answer is probably not. But first of all, the first year we had problems with our harnesses. The second year we put out 40 tags, and the Arboretum put a parking lot. They didn't even ask us, and we put out 40 tags, and we came back a few weeks later, and the entire area where we had tagged them was turned into.
You're breaking up a little bit, Bruce.
We got tagging information. 3 were from the same. Okay. So a parking lot destroyed our tagging study. We got 4 birds back. 3 of those birds were from the same community and they all went to different places. So based on a very small sample size, it seems that they don't go to the same area, but it's preliminary in a small sample size.
Do the nuclear families, if you have a parents and their children, they're together in the summer, do they have the same social group in the winter? Do they go to the same flock? Or the data seem to indicate at the end that they don't go to the same flock?
That's correct. We do not find relatives. There are a small number of relatives. They might come in small numbers as either siblings or parent offspring, but they don't go to the same community. And in general, there's not many relatives in our population. So that suggests that families, unlike geese or cranes, that families aren't migrating together. And that actually makes sense. For songbirds, siblings might, often the adults and juveniles migrate at different times. So if there was going to be family groups, it would probably be siblings. And that actually has been shown for some songbirds and others, that the young birds disperse or migrate as relatives. And that's possible, but it's not going to be an overwhelming pattern.
Okay.
We have quite a few members in our group that are really into plants. And someone has asked, what plants attract golden crowns? Do you have any particular species of plants that they love?
If you're a gardener, I'm told by all my friends that are gardeners, if you're a gardener and you plant kale, the sparrows will come and eat all of your kale. So the kind of plants that would attract them is stuff they'll eat, which is unusual. So yeah, if you want to have a sparrows, make a little garden of tender young grass or young green vegetables that they'll eat.
In terms of seed, is there a particular seed combination that they like?
They love millet. Yeah. But it raises an interesting question that, I like feeding birds, but some people do say, should we be feeding birds? Because you're changing their behavior in that. And as a scientist, I can go either way on that. I don't have a problem with it. I don't mind feeding birds, but it is something that we should be sort of thinking about, is like, is there a net benefit to this? I personally think there probably is, because of all the negative crap we throw at birds and just the sheer enjoyment that we get from being able to watch and observe birds in our garden. So I have a bird feeder in my yard, but I know some people raise this issue as like, is this always having a good effect?
One of the questions, Bruce, is you have a bird that has a breeding plumage. It has that, either bright gold or dull gold, and doing that. As the birds age and they come back year to year, do they demonstrate that similar plumage, or does the color variation vary as they age and you see them year to year?
That's when I said earlier that it's consistent. There's some consistency. So if we catch a bird, and I should actually dig that. I actually have photos of birds across many years. You can actually look at their crowns, and they look remarkably the same. So if a bird's kind of dull, you can get old birds, you can get like females in particular that just stay dull their whole life, or that are intermediate. There's some pretty remarkable consistency. So I think that they're being remarkably consistent from year 2 onward.
Okay.
That doesn't rule out also an age. You can still get consistency, but it could be that a bird's consistent but gets a little bit more black each year. So those are not mutually exclusive. And we haven't looked at the age effect yet, but they're striking consistent differences. Whereas we never see a bird that's, as a 2-year-old, it's dull, and then it becomes jet black in its 3rd year. It may be dull and then a little bit brighter, but I suspect it's genetic variation, to be honest.
Does that mean when they come back year after year, that their position in the flock and the situation they're in as far as dominance or recessive is the same?
It's a great question, and we haven't looked at that yet. But that's a superb question, because you might expect older birds to get increasingly dominant. And there's hints of that, but we haven't done the statistical analysis yet, but that's a good question. It does get a bit tricky, because figuring out how to measure dominance isn't as easy as I thought. It used to be that you could just make a dominance hierarchy, but for any of you that are chess people, there's something called ELO rankings that they rate chess players. And that's what we're now using to look at dominance in sparrows. And it's not just who you beat up. You're actually, if you're dominant over a more dominant individual compared to dominant over subordinate, that counts more. So that's like saying you got two chess players, you got two rank amateurs. Hey, I'm a rank amateur, but I just beat this other rank amateur. That's different from two world-class chess players where one beats the other. Being a super dominant individual counts for more. And so that's the sort of thing that you have to take into account. Problem is, year to year, depending on survival, the structure of the population may change, so that some years you might have a few really good chess players. Another year, they might be all good chess players. So it makes it a little bit tough to compare across years.
Another question came up is, does the social dominance patterns vary between sexes?
From our dominance experiments, we showed that females are just as dominant to males given their plumage. But given that females tend to be a little bit duller in the wild, that we don't know, and we need to look at that. We're working on that. We're working on the plumage and dominance of our wild population now. We've done these experiments. We now need to look at the patterns for wild birds, and I think Dye has done that, and I don't think there's a big sex effect.
Okay. How about, when you're doing those experiments with the black and gold patches, did you try putting a black patch on a much smaller bird than the other bird in the arboretum with them? And was there any effect?
No, we didn't try. We tried to match birds because our question initially was just, are they using this as a signal? Okay. The question you're asking is a really good one, and we haven't done that yet. And we've avoided messing with our arboretum birds. When I said we looked at this, we repeated this experiment with birds that are familiar with each other, we went to a separate site and worked with that. So we haven't actually been willing yet to mess up our natural population. But it's an interesting question.
Yeah.
Because if you make a dominant bird wimpy, does that have the same effect if you make a wimpy bird dominant? And probably not.
Okay. Wendy asked, are the same birds singing year after year? When you're not the next?
I need to look at that. We have the data, and I have not yet looked at whether there's a consistency there. And that's right on our list. In the next few weeks, we should have an answer to that, but it's a really good question.
We want some of our folks to get their masters this evening by the quality of their questions.
Yeah, no, these are good. No, I often find when birders often have a good instinct if they're actual naturalists. That pure twitchers that don't care about natural history often don't have good questions because they're about field identification and they're good at it. But people that watch and really know the natural history, they often come up with really, really good questions. And I get that with my undergrad students. I'll often go, someone won the Nobel Prize for that question 2 years ago. You're 2 years too late.
It would have been a good question if they could answer it, yeah, for Nobel Prize. Yeah. Hey, let's see, Barbara, somebody said, Wendy said singing is dominant, but looks aren't everything. So if you have a good singer, you don't have to have the looks in the crown patches.
Right. Yeah. But some birds are both good looking and sing as well. So it's not just the wimpy ones that sing. All I meant to say there, that if you control for their plumage, are they as dominant as you expect or more? And so it doesn't mean that only the wimpy ones are singing. It just means that if you take into account what kind of plumage they have, are they winning more fights than you'd expect?
Yeah. One of the questions, if you have some birds sing in a flock and some don't, is there anything the flock as a group does to protect the singers? Are they like some special bird in the flock that the other ones want to protect from predators and other things like that?
We wondered if they were playing a special role, and they may be more dominant, so that maybe the other ones don't want to protect them. They may fear them more. I mean, I think what I found was that singers tend to have more friends. They have more of those bars connecting to them. And that just might make sense, because if you have more friends, you have to prove yourself more. So that's just, I'm just speculating at this point. We haven't really dug deeply, but I don't think singers are special in terms of being more valuable, and it would be more of an individual thing. For a while, we sort of thought that singers might be the mafia overlords. We sort of wondered because they just do weird things. It's kind of like the boss who's running the show, and yeah, that may be true, but but we're not sure yet. And I think you might have asked about how we do the relatedness. Was that your question? Or were you passing that on for somebody else?
Which one was that, relatedness?
How do you determine that the birds in the flock were kin? Was there a genetic analysis? That was yours, right?
Yeah.
You use genetic markers. I mean, the two ways to figure out kin is to actually have a pedigree and know who the parents are. So when you actually can follow birds on the breeding ground, you can establish what's known as a pedigree. And then you can look at kids and grandkids and that. Since we're not on the breeding grounds, we have to use indirect inferences. But what people have found is if you use these genetic markers, kin are more likely to share the same genetic markers. So there's statistical ways of basically what you're saying is what's the similarity in the genetic markers we're using. And the markers are genes that have incredible variations. So for a given gene, you might have 20 versions of the gene. And so the chances that strangers would share the same copy of that gene is quite small. And if you get enough different genes like this, you get a pretty strong inference because kin will completely non-randomly share a lot of the same rare, what are called alleles.
Right. Sort of what they do for, what is it, 49 and
absolutely. It's exactly the same. It's exactly the same. Exactly the same software and actually the same markers.
Ah, really?
Yeah. I think they use microsatellites. I should actually look at that 49. What is it? What did you say? 49andMe?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure what the name is of the company, but there's a number of companies that do the same genetic analysis and tell you what your heritage is and where you come from.
Oh, can I answer a question?
Sure can.
Regarding the color experiment, I have heard from Wendy, I've heard that birds see the UV spectrum. Yes, we've thought about that a lot. And anytime you do these experiments, the negative nabobs who want to find reasons to critique your study say, wait a sec, it could be the UV. and so we've done a lot of color studies. We actually have a machine, it's called a spectrophotometer, that measures the actual color of the birds. You can ask whether the birds have UV in their plumage. And they have a little bit in the yellow, but not a ton. In the black, none. So we matched the black and the yellow to the precise color of the birds with the exception that the yellow didn't completely match the UV, but compared to many birds, the ultraviolet component of the signal is pretty small. And the reason this is important is humans can't see UV. So the reason we have to use a machine is because our eyes don't have the cones that allow us to see UV, so we can't measure it with our eyes. We need a machine that's sensitive to it. So that's a great question.
Leslie asked about blue-eyed fresh grass seeds, native plants that you might be able to use.
I just know that that they love Australian plants. So grevillea, so they love nectar and flowers. They really love those. So if you've got an arboretum that will sell grevillea, I know the sparrows love those, as do hummingbirds. And just planting beds of sort of baby kale or small little grass shoots would attract them as well. They do eat a lot of green stuff, which is weird. They think they're Canada geese or something.
Oh, that's amazing. Have we answered the question? If a new bird wants to join the group, how do they go about accepting that new bird?
That's a fantastic question, and we wish we knew the answer. We've got some data we collected to try and get at that we haven't analyzed yet. My sense is, the natural history sense is, we've watched them a lot in the fall, young birds would recruit as juveniles from that year. So they would have been born 3 or 4 months before they get here. We often see what look like young birds based on the really dull crown. The inferences are young. off to the side in little flocks that hang out. They'll sort of be with a flock, but not fully part of it. And then we'll often see one of the flock members come over and interact with them. And so it's almost like they're kind of insinuate themselves into the flocks. And there may be some testing. We don't know, but we have a huge, one year we banded like crazy in the fall and trying to see which birds eventually were successful in getting in the community. So we can actually ask that question. Was there something special about the birds of the large number we banded of the ones that eventually were able to get into community? So we hope to be able to address that with that data set, but we'd love to know.
You wonder if they have an NBA draft. You know, they want dominant birds.
Well, or maybe wussies. Who knows? I mean, it just we just don't know. But the communities need new blood, because eventually, whenever the old birds die, that social memory is lost. So it's kind of dependent. The whole system is dependent on fresh blood.
And how long did the birds live? About 6 years or so?
I would say the average is about 3 years.
Okay.
But because, you know, if you just do the math, just multiply survival probabilities. If there's a 50% survival each year, it's 50% times 50% by 50%. You're very soon down to like about 20% of the population just in 3 years. Yeah. And I actually ran those numbers. And I think that the mean lifespan is somewhere between 2 and 3 years.
Okay. Oh, somebody asked about at the end here, song variation in the birds. All your birds sing exactly the same, or do you hear some variation?
There's two ways to answer that question. One is dialect. Golden-crowned sparrows don't have the same kind of dialects are where you get geographically discrete sounds, like white-crowned sparrows. If those of you that knows white-crowns, there's regions up and down the coast where in a small area, all white-crowned sparrows sound the same, and they sound different from up the coast. Those are dialects. Golden crowns don't have that kind of thing, but there's broad scale. I think there's a 4-syllable dialect and a 3-syllable dialect. And we get mostly 3-syllable dialects that suggest they're probably Alaskan birds. But what we do get is variation in quality. Some birds really, they sound like garbage. They like whisper, they might get 1 syllable out. You know, in that video I showed you, one bird was singing 1 note and the other bird was singing 2 notes. Those are crappy songs. Some birds sing the full on, and then other ones like barely hear it. And so the variation is more in just how, the quality. Is it loud? Is it raspy? Is it clear? And we've collected data on that. So again, we'll be able to ask if some birds are consistently better than others. Are females worse than others? Because think about this. Females don't sing in summer. They only sing in winter. And so they're having probably to do some kind of different kind of learning program than what we think of what's going on for males. And that raises an interesting question. It's like, how are females doing this? For a bird that doesn't sing in summer, but can sing in winter, what's the mechanism that allows them to learn that? And are they as good as males? Are they worse?
Some hormonal change in the summer?
Yes.
Knocks it out.
Yes. Yeah, and well, that's an interesting point too, which is these birds are singing in winter without hormones. People, at least we believe so, but maybe not. People have thought that the reason white crowns sing in winter is because they get a pulse of hormones at equinox. No, sorry, not at solstice. That they're using the changing light levels, but I think it's got to be probably more than that.
Huh. Interesting. Let's see. Other questions that came in. Do crowned sparrows mate with the fancy golden-crowned characters? Are there new species coming along?
That sounds like a funny story, but it's actually a really good question. If you actually look at the genetics of white crowns and golden crowns are really closely related. There's been some hybridization, and clearly in the past there has been some crossbreeding. And my student Dai actually went to Alaska to study this problem and asked, why don't they hybridize more? And he found out that nestling golden-crowned sparrows right out of the egg can tell a golden-crowned song from a white-crowned song. Because babies will beg. If you play a song in a nest, the babies will beg at the song. And he did these playback experiments to newly hatched golden-crowns. And if you play them a golden-crowned song, they begged. And if you played them a white-crowned sparrow song, they weren't interested, which is pretty interesting. So that question got chuckles, but it's actually it's an interesting evolutionary problem about the risk of hybridization, because these guys are so closely related.
Let's see. Are you reading the chats, Bruce?
Yeah, I can go through. Let's just see.
There's two at the end here from Wendy. One about genetic checking, and the other about Alaska birds. Maybe better for you to read them and see what sense you make of them.
Yeah, for the relatedness, we have too few. So we found a few. There's a small number of birds that we think might be related. And I should point out that unlike a pedigree analysis, the looking at genetic markers is not super strong as a population level. It's pretty good, but you can't be really certain that when it says these guys are sisters or brother sister, that's not likely to be so accurate. So it's probably, given our sample and the reliability of our approach, we can't really get at heritability of the plumage crowns, but it's a great question. And if you bred them in captivity, you could probably get at that. Oh, are the winter communities all coming from the same breeding area? No, and actually Point Blue is looking at this as well, and they've had more success with their tags, and it looks like they had some early work with light level tags, and now they're using GPS tags that are actually accurate to 10 meters. Oh, it's pretty clear that the birds are not all coming from the same summer area. The 4 birds we had were from all completely different areas of Alaska. And what's remarkable with these tags, you could see the summer territory of the birds. So the birds, when we got tags and it worked, it was like you blew up where they were seen in the summer, and it was like a 300-yard area of Alaska the entire summer. So we could actually see the territory of these birds based on the tagging information. It's pretty remarkable.
Wow. So these are GPS tags, small tags they're putting on their back?
Yep. Use a harness around their legs, and they're now the tags, they've shrunk the technology, so they're now about 1 gram, and they are deadly accurate. It's pretty phenomenal. The tagging revolution is just nothing short of remarkable.
Wow.
They're doing the same with fish, I think, too. They're tagging them with like really micro hair type tags.
Yep, and there's various different styles. Friends of mine just did a study. You may have seen it. It got into the New York Times about acorn woodpecker warfare. These guys at Hastings put on these tiny little tags that when the tags go by a reader, it's registered, and they have these readers all over their study site. And so they were able to sort of map what happened, where the birds come from when there's a contest over an empty territory. And it's pretty remarkable. Birds are coming from kilometers to either participate in the warfare or just watch it. And so that's a different type of tag. You don't have to catch the bird again to get the information. Whereas with our tags, you have to catch the bird and retrieve the tag, because there's no communication between the data on the tag and either a satellite or a receiver. So
with the woodpeckers, they're family based. So do they come as a whole group, sort of like those mockingbirds on the beach in the Galapagos, and all fight together at the same time?
Absolutely, except it's by sex. So I talked to the authors because it wasn't clear in their paper. So if all the female breeders on an acorn woodpecker territory die, there's a vacancy for a group of females. And so then different groups of females will fight to be the group of females that then get in that territory. And what's really weird about it is it's kind of like a marriage. The females come in, the males in the territory have no say, but whatever females win, it's like, all right, hey, you're my bride. It's a really freaky. I love the acorn woodpeckers are fabulous. What a fantastic bird.
They're a good group. Faith asked a question here. She has white crowns at or Faithful Fools. So I'm not quite sure who that is.
Yeah.
White crowns at the feeder, and will golden crowns come too? They exclude each other, and you see them. We saw them today.
Yeah.
Golden crowns and white crowns together. So I'm assuming they don't chase each other.
No, and even if they do, when we put out seed at the Arboretum, there's a pecking order. The thrashers are dominant over the spotted toys. The spotted toys are dominant over the cow toys. Cow toys are dominant over fox sparrows. Fox sparrows are dominant over golden-crowned sparrows. Golden-crowned sparrows are dominant over white crowns. But the feeders are often empty so that everybody gets to eat. Eventually the thrasher gets full and then the towies come in. So even if one's dominant over the other, they're not going to exclude them completely. It's not like a hummingbird feeder where the hummingbird really will defend. So the sparrows come in, they're not defending it as a territory, but they're using their dominance to get the food when they're there. So that's really different. A territory means no one's going near that feeder, which is what Anna's hummingbirds do. But if the golden crowns are not there, it's not because the white crowns keep them out. And in fact, the golden crowns are dominant over the white crowns.
Wow, didn't realize that. You mentioned feeders for Anna's hummingbirds, and you mentioned the golden crowns like nectar. Do they tend to try to go to hummingbird feeders?
I have not seen that, but I gave this talk a couple of weeks ago to I forget what the banding station down at Coyote Creek or whatever. And someone told me they were getting golden crowns to their hummingbird feeder.
Okay.
And I said, oh, that makes sense because they will drink out of nectar from plants.
Right. Okay.
So Bruce, we've had a tremendous amount of thank yous and really appreciation for how informative this has been. I know I'm going to look at sparrows very differently from now on, and I'm going to go to the park tomorrow and listen to see who's singing.
Well, there's a general message here, which is all of this stuff. I mean, not the genetic stuff, but as a naturalist, you can learn a lot of it. Like we were basically bird watchers that watch these for a long time. So you can learn a lot. I've been like good birders. So I encourage you all to just go out and watch stuff. And pay attention and start sort of saying like, oh, that's weird. Why are they doing that? And so, yeah, hopefully it'll stimulate you to just go make your own discoveries because there's still a ton of discoveries left to be made.
Well, we had nearly 50 folks today, which is a good record number for us. And, during these COVID times, it's been crazy to get people all congregate, but we really appreciate your informative talk. It was really eye-opening to me, and I know it's gonna help us be better birders and better naturalists. So thank you ever
Wonderful.
so much. Let's give them a round of applause from those of us that are here. And
thank you for all coming. I love giving these kinds of talks. It's really fun.
And for those of you still on, we were able to record it, I believe. So we will try to post this via our website sometime tomorrow so that people that weren't able to be here will be able to listen in. So I guess you get royalties every time someone watches it, Bruce. All right.
Well, thanks for inviting me. I'm going to go have some supper now.
Oh yes, really. I guess if you're Canadian, that's what you have. So everyone, thank you for being there and keep checking in on the website. We're trying to continue to update that and post new things as well as our Facebook page. So thank you very much for coming and participating.
Right.
Cheers, everybody.
Thank you.